Welcome back to Leveraging Leadership, where we unpack the art of business leadership. I'm your host, Emily Sander, Chief of Staff turned Executive Leadership Coach. This show is all about finding your points of greatest influence and leveraging them to better serve those around you. Our guest today is Charette. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting.
Can you just give us some context and explain your, I think it was 10 years at Wells Fargo, and a number of those years were as chiefs of staff, various chiefs of staff roles.
Correct. Yeah, I can explain that. So my background is actually in user experience design. That's my recent background. So probably the last 20 years, I've been in user experience design. So for those of you who are not familiar with user experience design, it's actually teams of people in organization that are designing the user experience for, it could be digital applications. It could also be physical experiences. So at Wells Fargo, for example, we have, if you go to a bank, you have experience at the branch, you have experience on your computer, your phone. So user experience is the design of all that experience for customers. So I've been navigating that space for about 20 years. At Wells Fargo, I've been there for almost 11 years now, and I've started with what we call design operations. So it was pretty much like managing projects, programs, resources, budget, everything we're all familiar with in regards to user experience design. And then I would say about 6 years ago, I was asked to migrate to a role of chief of staff. So what does that mean for me at Wells Fargo is that I've been supporting actually throughout those 6 years, I would say 4 senior executive in the space of user experience design as a chief of staff. And my responsibilities include things like helping manage their groups, their priorities, their stakeholders, working on special projects. Example, it could be procurement projects for getting new design platforms, everything that has to do with legal and compliance. So the bottom line here is basically as a chief of staff, supporting those executives for the success of their design team. So that's what I've been doing for the last 11 years, 6 of them as a chief of staff.
Okay. So did you say someone tapped you on the shoulder for the chief of staff role? How did you get there? So I think you had an internal Wells Fargo position and then you moved into chief of staff role, yes?
That's correct. And you know what's really, really funny about this is it's not like it was a position that opened up and I applied. What was funny was actually the digital group got a gentleman actually that came in as a senior executive for one of the user experience groups because we have so many products, so many experiences. So that gentleman came in. And my boss at the time, which was leading the operation, the design ops operation of that group, was kind of trying to find a way to help that executive. And the way it happened, he basically reached out and say, "What would you think if I would lend you to that executive to actually help him out to understand, the ropes of the way we do design ops?" And I was like, of course, like being in service. So I was like, no problem with that. I didn't even think twice about, what does that mean for my job? I was like, yeah, sure, I'll help him. What I didn't know at the time was that what I was asked to do was actually to be a chief of staff. So I went out to help that executive, and that executive kind of was surprised, number one. And number two was saying, "That's really nice of you guys." And then he said, "What are you going to do for me?" And of course, it was like, "Well, what do you want me to do for you? Like, how can I help you?" And that led to his needs, and it led to jumping on different things, his priorities. And that led basically for that executive to turn back to my manager at the time and say, "Is there any way I can keep Richard? He's been very useful. I love what he does for me. I still don't understand what he does, but he's with me all the time, and he's picking up everything that I need help with." And then at the time, the position was created. And what was even funnier is nobody knew exactly how to call that position. They were like, "Well, Richard's going to be helping this executive." And what should we call it? And that's when actually we came across the chief of staff, and I said, well, it looks like what I'm doing is a chief of staff role. And again, not to extend too long on that story, but that's such a funny story because people were like, chief of staff, like we're not the White House. We're not like, is
West
that
Wing.
the right terminology? And I was like, well, let's start with that and see where it goes. And then I start doing research about what the chief of staff does. And then we formed the role. And then I stayed in that role since then with that executive. But later on, I was asked to do the same role with different executives. So that's
Okay.
the long story of it.
No, that was great. So you actually came up with the title chief of staff.
Correct.
Okay. And are there other chiefs of staff at Wells Fargo, or is that a brand new
No, they
role?
are. They are. At the
Okay.
time, what I didn't know is that there were a few across the bank. Got to remember, the
Oh, okay.
bank is over 200,000 employees. I didn't go do a research, but in our digital group, which is a very large group, there was none at the time. There were some individuals actually that played a role. They just didn't know it. So,
Right. Different
and
time.
then in the user experience group, the design group, um, after that, some other executives came and say, "Hey, I want a Richard. I would like to know, I would like somebody like that." And then we decided to create, I think it was at the time, 5 chief of staff positions within the design organization, and that remained for a while. And after that, it kind of went away. I think that's a deeper conversation. Some of the individual that decided to apply for those roles didn't exactly know what it meant, and I'm pretty sure all of us as chief of staff, that's going to resonate. Either the chief of staff thought they were admins. Some of them
Yeah.
actually try to formalize the position to such degree that their principal, their executive, uh, didn't want to formalize because they didn't know what they want in the first place. So to this day, they're still chief of staff, but that world has been shifting quite a bit.
Interesting. And you said you worked with a number of different executives, and were those in succession, so one at a time, or did you support multiple executives at the same time?
In succession,
Okay.
except when I was lent to the first one because I still had my
Right.
manager. Um, and with that manager, I wasn't actually a chief of staff. I was reporting to that manager. But funnily, um, I realized that I was already doing chief of staff with my manager. The approach, the way I was trying to help him, that made me realize. So at that time, I was serving really 2 executives. But
Right.
after that,
And
it
you
was
mentioned
succession.
yeah, yeah, thank you. And I think you mentioned like 3 or 4 executives. So I'm wondering how do you um how do you get used to partnering with a new executive? Because that's a pretty close relationship, right? And so if you're saying, okay, I'm going to be chief of staff, I've done this role before, but certainly a different principal presents a whole entirely different version of that chief of staff role. So how did you go about learning each of the executives' kind of idiosyncrasies and patterns and strengths and weaknesses and all that good stuff?
That's a great question. That's a great question. I think in retrospect, um, I would say one of the main quality for a chief of staff, that's my opinion, of course, but one of the main quality of a chief of staff from a career perspective, not just one. So meaning throughout your career as a chief of staff, one of the main quality is what I would call having a beginner's mind, which is if you
Mm,
work for a principal, assume nothing. Open your mind to that principal. Because if you come from a place of ego, if you come from a place of, oh, I've done it before with somebody else, and um, in my experience, not a good start. So the secret sauce for me was when I was told from my boss to be lent to the other one, I was like, I don't know who that person is. That person probably is going to think he's my boss, although I have a boss. I don't know what he thinks. And then every time I would switch principal, I would erase everything from my head. I wouldn't try to come from a place as I know how to do this. Of course I do, but um, I would say I don't know that principle. So a beginner's mind, and beginner's mind also I think is very much related to you don't have a relationship with the new principle that you have, and to build relationships You need to put your ego aside. You can't come from a position of like, let me tell you how that position works. Let
Yeah.
me tell you, you got to build relationship capital. And that's always been my approach is beginner's mind. Don't assume anything. Don't be biased. Don't get attached also. I know I'm saying I'm probably going to sound, somebody's probably going to say you sound like a Buddhist, but it's very true. Don't get attached to the previous principle. Maybe you like the previous principle and you're going to serve a new one, and maybe you're not going to like her as much or him as much. And don't go there. Don't get attached. Open your mind, observe, learn, build relationship capital. And if you do a good job, in my case, it always turned out pretty good. So,
Yeah, I love that. Have a beginner's mind.
mhm.
That's a great mantra and approach to lots of things in life. So, Richard, can you tell us how you got introduced to McChrystal's program and working with knowing about his chief of staff, Chris, and the 4 quadrants that they propose?
Absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, I'm so glad you're bringing that up. So what led for me to find the McChrystal group is actually the move that my manager did when I got introduced to the chief of staff position, which is like, I'm going to lend you to help that executive. Um, now, I kind of wanted to know, what am I going to do? And I start kind of looking, and then I came to realize this is really a chief of staff kind of role in a way. At first, I was like, maybe it's an assistant. And then I said, it can't be. That was my own bias. I was like, I'm not an assistant. No, I refuse to be an assistant. What could it be? It will be being a chief of staff. And then I was like, okay, what is a chief of staff? And then I ran into the McChrystal Group, which is an organization, very mature organization, solid, led by a retired General Stanley McChrystal. For those of you who are maybe a little allergic to the military, please don't be in regards to that. I mean, the way that the McChrystal Group works, although they come from a military leadership, they've been doing a tremendous job to adapt to corporation. They're not going to try to make, generals out of you. So I did my research, and then I found the McChrystal Group. And before I even kind of reach out to them, I realized that Stanley McChrystal actually wrote with his chief of staff, Chris Puzzle, books. I said, I'm going to buy the books. I'm going to read them. If I like them, then I'll start considering the organizations. I read the book. I'm not going to name them here, but if you look at Stanley McChrystal, Chris Puzzle books, there are phenomenal books on leadership, chief of staff, team building. They have one, I think, called Team of Teams.
Yes.
Phenomenal books. So I read all of them, and I was like, I love this guy. What do I have to offer? Can I talk to them? So I reach out to a couple of individuals at the McChrystal Group through LinkedIn, just connected. Reach out to General McChrystal through LinkedIn, say, hey, we have a business relationship. I read your book. He accepted, got introduced to Chris Puzzle. And then I realized that they had a chief of staff training program. And it was like phenomenal. And it was given at the time by Chris Puzzle. So I was like, I got to do this. So I went and I did it. And it's not very long. I mean, I think it took like 2 or 3 months. I don't know if the program has evolved, but any chief of staff should go and take a look. It's phenomenal. It's not the only program, but so that's what led me to go through that. Now, why would they be qualified to give that training? The main reason is actually Chris Puzzle. He's the one who actually he's the one who wrote the book with General McChrystal. And he was his chief of staff. So right there from the get-go, that gave him all the credibility I needed. So I did the program with them. Phenomenal thing. One big takeaway that you actually did mention was the 4 quadrants. That was probably the massive insight for me. And the 4 quadrant, if I may, is introduce that a little bit, is when I became a chief of staff, having a beginner's mind, you just don't know how you start. I think it's true pretty much for all of us chief of staff, is when we get a new principal. And I want to be clear also, when I say principal, that's terminology that came from the McChrystal Group. The principal is actually the executive you're serving as a chief of staff. So your principal is your master, so to speak, right? So when I became chief of staff, I didn't know where to start. And then I was like, what can I expect? And the four quadrants is actually very interesting because it's a progression. Let's call it a maturity progression of a chief of staff. And sometimes I remember jumping on so many chief of staff webinars, conversation, and some folks would say, well, that's interesting that you have a close relationship with your principal. I feel like an executive admin for mine. And there was always that kind of, well, it shouldn't be like that. And then some people say, well, but it is like that. And some people say, well, why is it like that? And why are you a partner and why I'm not? The answer to this is the four quadrants model, which is really a maturity progression. So when I started as a chief of staff, having been exposed to four quadrants, the first thing I told myself is, number one, is I need to take care of all the little things that my principal needs.
Sure.
You need your email set up. I will set it up for you. You need to know where you get your badge. I will do that for you. So that's very much kind of an admin type of job. There are menial things that I think is tripping chief of staff sometimes, especially when you're new to a principal. It's like, I'm more senior than that as a chief of staff. Why are you asking me to solve your email problems? Well, that's the first quadrant. You got to start with that. That's the trust. They call it the trust builder. If you can't do the little things, you can't do the big thing. That's a quote by many people, including General McChrystal. If you can't do the little things, you can't do the big things. So the first quadrant is very much like what we would call the EA, executive admin type. And for me, there was no issue. I was like, of course, it's a progression. And then the second quadrant is basically your principal starting to trust and say, could you help me set some things with other people? So very much so still an admin, but now you're asked not only to help your principal, but to help his partners, to help his teams. And so that's the second quadrant. Now you're jumping to bigger things. Feels very much so still as an admin. You're like, when am I going to participate in establishing the strategy or your team? Not quite there yet. So second quadrant, organize bigger things. The third one is the place where the principal would come. And here I'm oversimplifying. I would invite every one of you guys to go take a look. But the third one is where the principal would say, hey, do you remember that big meeting you're organizing over there with my stakeholder? Well, I'm going to be late. Why don't you present that thing that I've prepared? Why not you run with that part, because I feel you know it pretty well. So now you're starting to kind of feel good because you're like, my principal's starting to ask me to represent her. In smaller ways, becoming bigger. That's the third quadrant. Suddenly now you're a representative. It's a lot more than that, right? And then the fourth quadrant is what I call the holy grail of chief of staff, which is when your principal will come and say, why don't you and I block 2 days and organize the quarterly meetings we're going to have with my leadership, and I would like you to prepare that with me because I need your insights. Or another example would be, in my case, would be my principal saying, let's you and I sit down to do a powwow to establish what's the landscape of user research platforms that we should contemplate, and what kind of budget we're going to ask. I need your brain to join mine to set that up. Once you reach that goal, you're in the fourth quadrant, and that's the phenomenal goal. This is really, I think, where it resonates as a chief of staff, is now you're a trusted partner, not only in organizing, planning, delivering, but also thinking, strategic thinking. So these are, in a nutshell, the four quadrants. And it's important to remember they build on each other. If you cannot solve your principal email problems, it's very unlikely that you're going to sit down for 2 days to think about all the vendors you could be investigating to acquire for a function in this group, right? So the first quadrant will always be there, very critical. It's a trust builder, and then you move to the fourth quadrant. So I'm going to stop right there, just in case you have any question. But in essence, that's pretty much what it is.
Thank you so much for that description. That was beautiful. And I think, the description of the first and even the second quadrant might be off putting to some chiefs of staff, but I think it's important to realize, as you mentioned, it's a progression. So it's a starting point. And if you're meeting someone for the first time, it's very unlikely they're going to jump all the way to the fourth, like, let's do a 2-day powwow type of thing. Maybe you will on a leap of faith, but I think the way you described it makes so much sense that it would be a natural progression through these stages. And I like what you said at the end, where it's a principle basically saying, I need your brain. So if you get your principal saying that in those words or in different ways, where I need your input, I'd like, your perspective here, I need your brain trust, I think that's when oh my goodness, now we're moving to that fourth quadrant, that full partnership
Mm-hmm.
mode. And when they're genuinely seeking your insight on something, and or they're confiding in you and saying, hey, I messed that up, can we talk about how to kind of course correct ourselves here?
That's correct. That's correct. And I think there's a couple of guiding principles regarding this as a chief of staff. It's
Yeah.
number one is coming back to that beginner's mind. Once you have a
Yeah.
first principle, a new principle, um, you got to build trust. It
Yeah.
doesn't matter if you've been a chief of staff for 20 years. You can't say, hey, trust me. These people, I mean, normally somebody who has a chief of staff, they're pretty high up in the organization. It could be the CEO,
Yeah.
it could be the CFO. So you always got to I always tell myself, he doesn't have to trust me. Even if I've worked for 25 years, he does not have to trust me. I need to build trust. And those quadrants, they're there to build the trust. So that's number one. The second guiding principle is you gotta need to be patient, because each human builds trust at their own speed. And building trust is not forcing yourself. It's not to say, hey, we've been in the first quadrant for 7 months. Could we move to the second one? Part of doing that kind of a move is destroying trust, because it's not
You
patient.
can't force it.
You
You
can't
can't
force
force it.
it. It's a human. It's
Yeah.
organic. You got to make the person comfortable. Be patient. That's another one, right? And
Yeah.
then the other guiding principle is the acceptance, non-attachment. Again, I'm talking like
Mhm.
a Buddhist, I guess, but non-attachment, that you'll ever make it to any quadrants. Now,
Mhm.
chances are, if you're asked to be a chief of staff, you're immediately in the first quadrant. Will you be in
Yeah.
the second one? Maybe. I mean, if you do a good job, chances are you'll be given more. I mean, I've never met an executive that wouldn't rely on a great chief of staff. If you can do more and you're trustable and you're capable, um, they will trust you. You'll move to the quadrants,
Yeah.
but it's no guarantee that your principal is ever going to make you a strategic partner. There's no guarantee,
No.
and for each one of
Uh,
us, it's a question of deciding, am I comfortable never getting there, or it's taking too long? That's a personal decision. But if you follow those principles organically, things happen, you know?
yeah, and I think it's case by case, individual by individual, for sure. I think I've known people who are, like, completely trusting out the gate, and I was like, "Whoa," because 'cause I'm not. You have to kind of establish that with me and build that up.
Right.
But I've met some people where it's like, open kimono, like, "We're just gonna jump into this," and I'm like, "Okay." So there are different individual approaches, and I think, you've been mentioning, just because I've been chief of staff for 20 years doesn't mean I have, the right answer for this particular principle,
Right.
which I think is true. But a lot of principals, if they're new to the role, or to their role, or new to the chief of staff role, they would understandably rely on someone who's had that role for so long, on kind of different versions and different ideas of what works. So there's that foundation, which I think you can learn from and build on. But the relationship with the principal is brand new. And
Correct.
that's where that
Correct.
beginner's mind has to come into play, where I might have different experiences and versions of the chief of staff role in my back pocket, which is great. but this is a brand new principal, so I can't bring assumptions into that part of it. So I love what you said there. What did you how did you apply what you learned from that program to being chief of staff? And I'm not sure, is the McChrystal group where you first got really into the idea of extreme ownership, or did that come later? Where did that come into
Well,
play?
so yeah, that's interesting. You bring extreme ownership. What is extreme ownership? Where did that come from? So I think, excuse me. So where do I start answering this? So being a chief of staff, one of the things I've recognized for myself is you got to take ownership of things. Ownership here doesn't mean, stay away from my job. It's like if you have a principle, if you, let's take, for example, a new principle, we're talking about building a relationship.
Yep.
You get a new principal, he doesn't talk much, he seems a little short, it's new, there's no relationship quite yet. Whose fault is it? Well, sometimes it's like, well, it's not my fault. I'm a chief of staff. I'm there to help him, and he doesn't help me. Extreme taking ownership is kind of taking the approach, and I know many are going to say, "Ooh, I don't agree with that," but I'll come back to that a little bit, why it's so important. But it's like, here's a new principal, and he's not very warm. He doesn't communicate. It's like, like, I don't know if we're going to get to the fourth quadrant ever because he doesn't help here. Well, taking ownership is to say to myself, whose fault is it if it's a cold relationship? The fault is mine. I'll repeat that. The fault is mine, not him. It's me. What can I do to build relationship with that principal? If I start from a position of, well, he's a cold person, it's like, that doesn't work for me. Then you don't take ownership of what you can do. That's why I like the principle of, starting with, what fault of mine is it that if something is like this, that means taking ownership. Now, extreme ownership is to look at your world with your principal, with their group, with their stakeholders, with their partners, and to always ask myself, what can I own in there that I have some level of control that I can fix? It's not about what can I own that I'm going to make mine. It's about observing, and it's about where can I help? It's a service mindset. It's about taking ownership of my abilities, my responsibilities, my accountabilities. And it's not on paper. Sometimes I remember at some point, even for myself, thinking, well, I don't think that's my job.
Yeah.
Extreme ownership is actually not saying that. It's like, this is not my job, but I could do something in regards to that responsibility that would highly benefit my principal. Therefore, I'm going to take ownership of what I can do, even if it's not on the job description, given that I'm not sacrificing my priorities, obviously. But extreme ownership is that kind of attitude. It's a no blaming attitude, which I'm going to say that very carefully, because sometimes things are pretty bad. Sometimes things are frustrating, but it's like resisting pointing fingers at where the problem is and to say, whose fault is it? Let's start first with me. That's the concept of extreme ownership. It's very uncomfortable, actually, but it's very powerful, because what I found with the individual I see doing that, and some example for myself, is that when you go down that route, you're kind of differentiating yourself from a lot of people, because
Absolutely.
it's not natural to say it's my fault.
You stand out. Yeah, you get people's attention for sure.
Right. People are like, what do you mean it's your fault? Well, it's my fault because I didn't do this. I wasn't curious enough. I didn't think of solutions to help you. You take ownership, and it's tough, because with principle, that kind of like, it shakes something within us, which is sometimes it's like, when we have a principal or even a manager, you don't have to be a chief of staff, is like, Your manager, is it, what kind of relationship is it? Is that theoretically you're there to serve your leader or your manager? There's a reason the person is your manager, and doesn't mean they're perfect, but if you start putting yourself in a position of confrontation, blaming, or and you don't look at what you could do to make this better, then the whole principle of extreme ownership say if you don't do that, um, you don't get a relationship. So if we come back to the four quadrants based on trust, and you want to be that strategic partner, no trust, no four quadrants, no ownership, no humility, no trust, no relationship. It's that simple.
Yeah. I mean, trust is the through line. And I love what you said because, especially in today's culture, it's usually a blame game or let me, look this direction, not make eye contact. It's not my fault. Please don't call on me. Please don't call me out type of thing. If you're in a group and you stand up and say, it's all my fault.
Mm-hmm.
Whoa. Like, hold on. Like, what did they just say? It's all my fault. Here's what I did. I didn't do this, this, this.
Correct.
And it just changes the dynamic. And I think putting yourself in that place of deliberate discomfort invites others to say, okay, well, actually, here's what our team, could have done differently or will do differently next time. And it creates that open space to have these meaningful conversations. And to your point, build relationships and build trust. So, extreme ownership can be uncomfortable. But as you were talking, I was thinking, this feels so much better because I'm in control.
Correct.
Because if it's like this manager is cold and it's like, all right, that's just the way it is. That's just the way it is. Well, that situation is kind of happening to you, where it's like, that's kind of, not very empowering.
Right.
Whereas if you're like, okay, well, this part is in my control. I own this part.
Mm-hmm.
I can help in this way. I can serve in this way. That's just it feels better, right? I am in control. Here are the pieces that I do own. So I think that's fantastic. And then I know that you've spoken about this sense of kind of Navy SEALs, samurais, these different elite warriors who are known for their physical prowess, but also have to have the mental chops, the mental capacity, and holistic.
Right.
Um, it's a holistic experience. So maybe talk a little bit about that because to me, being chief of staff is what's the word I'm looking for here? It's kind of all encompassing. You have to bring your whole self to the role to really invest in it and serve in that capacity well. And I'm just wondering where these components of extreme ownership and kind of holistic elite performance come into play from your perspective.
Sure. Sure. And I'm so glad you're curious about that, because not many people have been working for what? Hold on a second. So I left the Canadian Forces and I started working. And so I've been in the corporate world for probably around over 30 years. And we think of work mostly as a mental capability, right? It's like, I'm going to say that carefully because I've been in design workshops. Sometimes you prepare, it could be physical too. You're standing up, you got to chase people around. It's emotional too, right? So mental,
Yes. Yes.
emotional. For some people, it's physical too. If you have to, organize a whole room for a brainstorming session, a workshop, it could be physical. You get up early in the morning, you don't have time to eat your breakfast. But for the most part, for people, work is in my corporate sphere, work is mental. So chief of staff, one could say, yeah, it's mostly mental and emotional. Okay, great. So I used to think like that. I was like, work is work. You get in front of your computer, you bring your A game mentally. Now, going back to those individuals that are very well rounded. Like I always got fascinated is like performance at work. What would be the ultimate image of that? Is like somebody who shows up early in the morning before people, get work done, doesn't come tired, doesn't need 20 cups of coffee. They're alert. They slept well. They're well nourished. They show up. They're awake. Um, they're composed. They're there. They're present. Um, you go in a meeting room. They're not slouching. They're They're physically,
Engaged.
they're
Yeah.
engaged, exactly. And then more than that too, because there's work, but if you take those unique individuals, Navy SEALs, Green Berets, um, firefighters, elite firefighters, or take your medical emergency technicians that are there.
Right.
Some of them show up, and you're like, look at them, and they have white shirts, and they show up to accident, and there's no stain on their shirt. They look very holistically well balanced about things. And then some of them, which I know personally, some of them they do those kind of works, and then they go back to their families, and guess what happened? They don't collapse. They go back, they take their uniforms, they put in the cleaner, they put their favorite t-shirt, their Bermudas, they play with their kids, they have energy. It's like, how do they do that? Like, you have a tough job, you're well-rounded, well-balanced. And I got really curious about that over a decade ago. I was like, could you be a corporate executive, a chief of staff, and could you aim at that? And the answer is absolutely. In fact, it's not only absolutely, is that if you don't pay attention to those things holistically, you will burn out.
Right.
The same way a Navy
Mhm.
SEAL would burn out if they're not. In fact, they probably won't stay on the teams. Or if you're a firefighter, after a couple of years, you can say, hey, I got to leave the profession. Um, Now, we're not firefighters. I get that. But nonetheless, we have a body, we have a mind, we have emotions, we have our beliefs, we have our intuitions, we have our biases, um, we have our social network that we need to make, our friends, our colleagues, our principal, our kids, you name it, right? So the holistic approach is not just a nice to have thing. Is if you want to have fun at work, if you want to perform as chief of staff, you want to be patient, if you want to build trust gradually while your principal is not easy to work with, and you don't want to carry that at home and be exhausted, there's an approach to this. There are ways to develop yourself like this. This has been proven a long time. And you were mentioning, for example, samurais, or this is not just elite teams in the 21st century. Top performers throughout the history, they had, a discipline of some sort. They have a way to holistically take care of themselves in service of others. And I know I'm a little bit over the map here, but for me, it's a very passionate thing, because for me, a chief of staff, I have a friend of mine who was saying, what is a chief of staff? And I kept trying to explain it. And he was, I still don't understand. Are you an admin? Are you? And I was like, you know what? If you work for an executive, you're actually a samurai, quite frankly. You're alone.
I love that.
You're alone. You're supposed to be very skilled. You're going to show up to a master's kingdom. You're going to have to get to know the master. He's going to ask you to do all kind of things, including, cleaning up the kitchen, to build an army and go fight somewhere. And you're alone. As a chief of staff, you're alone in that one role. And once I start making that comparison, I was like, samurais, they have things like the Bushido, a set of core values. They have their discipline. They have ways they take care of themselves. They're very humble, and they serve their master. Well, for me, I was like, wow, that sounds pretty much like what I do. So,
Yes.
so that's what led me actually to your question about holistic development and extreme ownership. Because extreme ownership, actually, the concepts, like the theory behind it, comes from a gentleman named Jocko Willing, which is a former
Yeah.
Navy SEAL. There's another school of thinking that I've been exposed to about 8 years ago, called Unbeatable Mind, led by another Navy SEAL named Mark Devine. I'm sure some of you have been kind of watching guys like David Goggins, guy that
Yeah.
runs like 100 miles. And well, okay, I wouldn't exactly, use that analogy for chief of staff, but nonetheless, he's very holistic. He's very determined. He's very composed, and he doesn't burn out. So that's what led me to all those things. And that's been helping me tremendously, not only being a chief of staff, but pretty much everywhere.
How does this connect to your alignment coaching. So what does alignment mean to you?
So alignment. Okay. So yeah, fantastic questions. So alignment, it was like, okay, extreme ownership. I'm about to speak up in a meeting and I'm about to say, I'll take the fall for this one. This is my fault. Why would I do that? I mean, it's one thing to say, you should do it, but it's hard. And I'm like, because sometimes also I wouldn't do it. I knew I should do it, but the words wouldn't come out of my mouth. It was like, I'm sorry for this one. No, it's not going to be my fault today. I'm going to stay quiet. And then the question came, why are you going to do this? And my answer was like, because I'm serving my principal. I'm serving my principal. It's not a job. It is a job, but even more than that is let's assume you're my principal. If we meet, I serve you. Now, nobody wants to hear that at work. I remember one time I got one principal and she said, what's your job description, Richard? And I was like, well, I don't know because we never talked about what you need. So I can't put a job description. I can give you an outline, but you may say, well, I'm not going to need this. I'm not going to need that. And then we're going to scrap the job description because you need something else. So her first name was Kathy, and I love this woman. And I said, Kathy, look, I mean, I'll make that simple for you. I'm here to serve you. And she was like, well, I don't know about that. Like, you're here to work, not here to serve me. I said, I mean it. I'm here to serve you to be successful. And I really meant it. I didn't say that like, I meant it like, if we meet and you're not happy with where things are going, I will say to you, it's my fault. There are some things that I could have done better. Maybe I didn't see something here. It's my fault. Why? Because I'm serving you. There's something I'm going to try to do better. You need to know that. So alignment. Alignment for me is the why. The why is like, why am I a chief of staff? Because I'm aligned as a human being to serve people. That's my North Star. That's true everywhere in my life. The North Star is what we call in alignment theory. I call it your object of alignment is the thing you're watching that you need to be aligned towards. So if you think of your principal and you say, well, no, I'm not serving my principal. He's he's not nice to me and he's always not happy with my work. And these are real feelings, but alignment is to remind myself, nonetheless, Richard, you're serving your principal. Stay aligned and then find the things that you need to do to stay aligned. Now, if I can't serve my principal after trying, then he's not my object of alignment anymore. Serving my principal will always be, but if the principal is not receiving service or refuse, then I can't align to service. I can't align to serving him. So that led to me to alignment. And then I started realizing over time, extreme ownership, all those things. You can do all those things, but you need to know why you're doing them. And that's really much so alignment. Why you're a chief of staff would be the first question I would ask to anybody is, if somebody would come and say, I'm a chief of staff and man, that's a hard job. And I mean, I'm going home and I'm pooped. I'm just like, I'm drained. My question would be, but do you like it? And if the question is like, well, it depends of the day, then I would ask, you need to check if being a chief of staff is aligned with your bigger you. Because if you're not, it's a job and it's okay that it's just a job. But when you have a job and you're not aligned with something bigger that's true for you, you're out of alignment. And being out of alignment, I don't know if you have a car, but when you get your car aligned, I actually met with a mechanic a year ago and I said, talk to me about alignment. He said, well, if you don't get your car aligned, You're going to get wear and tear on your tire a lot faster. The ride's going to be uncomfortable for people in the car. You will have problems steering your car. These applies to life. These apply to anybody who's misaligned about anything.
Yeah, I
So,
think the car analogy works, if I can just jump in, because like if you're even a little bit, a fraction out of alignment, you're constantly course correcting, trying to go straight, and it's like it's a wear and tear on the whole system.
right,
And I think there could be like a further analogy with like the wheel. So you were talking about the physical and mental and emotional pieces of this, where if those are kind of represented by tires,
right,
and like you're going, 0 to 60 on one tire, like, I don't know, mentally, but physically, you're not taking care of your body with sleep and nutrition and play and all those things. And that tire's flat while you're going down the road with like not all four tires aligned and not all four. So like you're going to go in a circle or you're going to be all janky. But I like that. I love that analogy of alignment in the car.
yeah. So that's very much true. So coming back to the 4 quadrants and the beginner's mind. Why a beginner's mind? Because you said it so well. You don't know that principle. And if you are in service of that principle, that means you need to be aligned with that principle. And if you don't know that principle, you need a beginner's mind to learn where that principle is aligning yourself.
Yeah.
If you don't
Yeah.
observe that, you won't understand your principle. You'll be out of alignment. Trust will not build. And guess what? Maybe you'll do menial tasks and you're not going to be a strategic partner. All of this because no beginner's mind, no understanding, no alignment. You don't know how she's aligned. Each human aligned to something.
Yes.
And it's so important, right?
Alignment coaching. Okay, so Rashard, this has been fantastic. We've covered so much ground here. If someone's listening is like, I am on board for the alignment coaching, where do I sign up? Where is the best place for someone to reach out and connect with you and learn more?
Go on LinkedIn, just reach out. My contact info is there. I will say this, I've been looking for alignment coaching around. It's very difficult to find. And the thing, and this is not a sales pitch, but it's just my own learning about alignment here is that what I found about alignment coaching sometimes is that it's you're going to find stuff that's aligned with the spiritual realm, aligning your mood, and which is all good. It's all good stuff. But if you think about alignment coaching in the realm of performance, in the realm of careers, in the realm of just reach out to me. And by the time you reach out, may not be now, may not be, but I'm continuously looking for resources about where do you find alignment, how do you find it, who can provide you help to align yourself. And there's plenty of people, they just don't know they're doing it, Could be your grandmother. Maybe she's having a chat with you and you don't realize, but she's asking you a question to try to help you find alignment about something in the family. So reach out. We'll have a conversation. I'm passionate about this. I came to realize over time that when we're misaligned, life is tough sometimes. Work is tough. Relationship can be tough. A task can be tough. You don't know why you're doing this task. If you're aligned, it's so much easier.
Yes. So get your tires inflated. Make sure your chassis or whatever aligns the car is aligned. And then also your big why, make sure you're driving your car in a direction that makes sense for you. So Rashard, this is beautiful. We'll have that contact info in the show notes so people can reach out. But thank you so much for being on. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks for inviting.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, share, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.